JavaScript promises. You need to know it, so let's get into it. A promise is actually quite simple. It seems difficult, but when you think about it as it is in real life, you can kind of see how simple it is. Really, it's just like real life. You can say, hey, I'm going to make a promise. So with that promise, you can either keep the promise and follow through, or you can break that promise and then something else will happen, right? So getting into the code implementation, if you just keep that in mind, you can see kind of how easy promises really can be. So we start off by just defining a promise in JavaScript. So we'll do that by saying let, and we'll just call this truth promise. We're going to set this equal to a new promise. So this promise object actually takes a single parameter. That parameter is a function. And that function that it takes two arguments. So it will take a resolve and it will take a reject. Resolve is for when you keep the promise, and reject is for when you break the promise. So we'll be able to say here that we have our basic promise set up. So we've created our promise, and now inside of the code block here, we need to define what that promise actually is. So we'll have a control variable here. We'll call this let is true. We will set this to true. So right now, it is always going to be true. So we will say if is true. We will resolve, so we will keep our promise because it is true. And here we'll just pass a message for the sake of this example, but it's important to understand you can pass anything to this resolve. But we will pass promise resolved. Now we need to handle the reject, so we need to handle when this promise is not kept and this promise is broken. So we will say reject, and we will say promise rejected. So now we have our promise defined. We have a control variable here that we've set to true, and then we're saying if is true, we are going to say promise resolved, and we're going to pass it this message of resolved. Else, so if is true is not true, we will pass reject. So we will break our promise, and we will pass a message of promise rejected. So obviously this code here is always going to be true because we've set true to is true. So this will always resolve. But we will now take our promise, so we've set it to truth promise, and we have methods on this promise to be able to access the resolve and the reject. The resolve is actually accessed through a dot. If you do dot, most IDEs you'll be able to see all of the available methods for this promise, because now truth promise is an actual promise object, so we have these methods that are available on them. So if we want to handle the resolve, we will say dot then. So our promise was kept, so now we're doing something with it. So we're saying promise dot then, and here we pass a single parameter to this, which is just the message. You can call this anything. Standard to say message or even MSG, but we will just pass message here. Now we're going to say with this message, we will just console log this so we can see that this is working as intended. So here we are saying with this truth promise object, which we've created above, when it resolves, we want to see what it gives us. And then if we want to also access the reject, so we want to know when that promise is broken, we will say dot catch. So this catch is another promise method, and this allows you to access when the promise is rejected or the promise is broken. This also takes a single parameter here, which we can say message, just as we did previously. This we will also console log, so we can see it working here. So So just to run through this again, we've created a promise. So we've set truth promise equal to a promise. And we've said we want to handle when we keep the promise and we resolve it. And we also want to handle when we reject the promise or we break the promise. Here we've defined our code. We know this will always resolve true. So when we save and run this code, we should actually see it log to the console that the promise was resolved. So we can do that now. And as you can see, our promise is resolved. So then if we go up here and we say, okay, is true, is not true. And we go through the code line by line. We say if is true. So here it is not true. So we're going to our else block. We should be rejecting the promise and we will pass it the message of promise rejected. We are catching this down here and saying, give me that message when you reject it, and we're displaying it. So if we were to save this, we will see promise rejected. Save it, and as you can see, we have promise rejected. So this is a great way and is standard to use when you need to do something in the background. So whether you're fetching large files from a server that's going to take some time and you don't want to stop the execution of other code, you would put that inside of your promise block here. So you would define a promise and do all of the things that you need to do in the background, so to say, and then pass it a message or pass it the result of what you're doing to be able to get that resolve or reject at a later time. So reject would be typically used if you're handling some error. So if you were to maybe fetch some files from a server here that may take a large amount of time and there's an error, you can continue going on with your application execution, and then you can find out nicely whether it was rejected or whether it was resolved, and then you can do something with those values at a later time. These are really meant to replace callbacks, and callbacks is another topic that seems a lot more complicated than it really is. But if you are to replace callbacks with promises, you will have a lot of benefits. You won't go into a so-called callback hell, and your code will just generally be a bit more concise, clear, easy to understand. But this is the general overview of how a promise works.